with respect to the ego running relationships, it has a pernicious need to want and to then use others as a means to achieve what it wants. These wants are not, they can be functional, right? You might need some things from somebody, but generally speaking, they're psychological. The need for admiration, the need for care, the need for comfort, or whatever. And many times these needs are based in basic human needs, right? Desires of the heart. But then the ego comes in and out of fear predicts that you're not going to get it. And so it finds all these ways to manipulate the situation, manipulate the person to ensure that you get it in excess. And it leads to neediness and it leads to dysfunction. Because anytime you put unnecessary, undue demands on another person, the relationship has an element of dysfunction within it. And then the other person will probably do the same thing back, because when you operate at a certain level, the other person operates at the same level, generally speaking, because relationships that are long-lasting and deep generally operate on a one-to-one basis. Both give as much as the other. And when they don't, it falls apart. The person who's giving less generally gets dropped, or they drop the other, whatever it may be. But long-lasting and deep relationships need to be operating in a mutual capacity. For example, Warren Buffett has a partner, I forget his name, but he says that in like 70 years of working with this guy, they've never had a fight. So they've been doing finance stuff for 70 some years, 60 years, 50 years, whatever, right? And they've never had a fight. Or maybe never had an argument, something like that, right? But surely there were disagreements. Surely they had major decisions to make that they didn't see eye to eye on. But they must have handled it consciously. And maybe not so, they're not thinking, oh, this is a spiritually conscious way to handle this, but they're like, all right, what do you think, Warren? Oh, I think we should do this. Well, what do you think? I think his name is Charlie. What do you think, Charlie? I think we should do this. I don't agree with that. Oh, I don't agree with that. How about we compromise? Or how about I get the decision this time, you get it next time? Something like that. Who knows? The fact remains, though, is that the partnership has worked and they're successful. They're both extremely rich, right? So this is one of the aspects of wealth creation as well that happens when you're able to work in a cooperative manner. And spirituality is not about wealth creation by any means, but when you operate with spiritual principles, the dysfunctions that normally ruin things and make things go awry or amiss, those dysfunctions go away, and then you can live in a better state, right? You'll be more successful with productivity, with wealth creation, with athletics, with happiness, with whatever. And that's one of the things that attracts people to spirituality when they're looking at it in a functional and materialistic sense. They think, oh, it'll make me more productive. Oh, it'll make me better able to handle harsh situations, right? And that's all. If it brings them in, that's good. But at some point, the awareness needs to rise above that. And it often does, and it often doesn't. But if people are meditating in order to make more money or to be more productive and get more things done, well, at least they're meditating, right? So going back to the relationship thing, consciously handling things is of utmost importance within relationships, because relationships are extremely complex, especially when you have deep personal needs. And the ego mindset is based on needs. It's not based on giving. It's not based on benevolence. It's not based on anything good, really. It's based on protecting yourself and then getting what you want. So when someone else is a means to an end for that, or a tool for that, the transcendent element of the relationship goes away, and it's not as happy as it could be. But when you see yourself as consciousness, right? Consciousness interacting with, well, consciousness within the other person, the whole thing changes. And you're there to be with the person and see what happens. And then you can give of yourself with more freedom, with less fear that this is going to work against you, with less fear that they're going to betray you or lie to you. And then the more trust that you operate with, the more trust is reciprocated, generally speaking. The more distrust you operate with, the more distrust is reciprocated. And the ego is completely distrustful. It's absolutely its very basis is distrust. It doesn't trust the universe. It doesn't trust that you'll survive. It doesn't trust that you'll get what you want. And so the more safety oriented you are with respect to needing overabundance of safety, the more actively you're going to regiment everything around you into certain categories that are unbending, unshifting, threats, non-threats, and so forth. And the more you're going to start manipulating and navigating yourself in correspondence with those categories that you've created. So when you're able to view things with clarity rather than with fear, you can see something that's not helpful, and instead of fearing it, simply, avoid it. And you can see something that can give you some comfort, and you can move towards it without desperately needing it. You've now attained a sense of freedom. You've now attained, you're not dependent on the ego's, categorizations. And you can see it on one level. This thing is bad, perhaps. This thing is good. And you don't need to spend a lot of time judging it or having emotional reactions to it or fearing this one and loving this one. You can instead simply see that, go towards that, without the heaviness and the weightiness and the need and the compulsive need to continue to find more and more things of same like kind. Right? When people have fear, their mind can populate an entire world of fear, a whole set of neuroses, and you look around and you're like, instead of living, which is what you're here to do, you're like, could that hurt me? Could that hurt me? Could that hurt me? Could that hurt me? Is that gonna happen? And when you have fear, you think that that's a sane way to actually look at the world, but it's not. But you think it's a good thing to do because it's necessary because you have fear. I knew somebody who used to look at every person and size them up based upon whether that person could beat him up. How tall is the person? How strong is he? Whatever. And he was actually aware that that's not actually a good way to handle it. But though he was aware of it, the mind still did it because it still runs on its own on its own tracks. So the spiritual thing here is the mind is doing what it's doing, has all of its fears and all of its attractions, and then to simply rise above it and be able to perceive things clearly. Then you can easily move towards the things that are attractive without it being a pull, and without this being this horrible aversion, this extreme reaction. And that leads to a sense of freedom. And it also leads to relationships like Warren Buffett has with his partner. And it leads to better relationships of any and all sorts. And whenever you see dysfunction arising within relationships, there's always, if there are two parties involved, there are always two parties involved. It could be the other person's fault in many ways. And that's how the ego always views it. Generally speaking, if you have a hostile ego, it's going to blame it on the other pretty much exclusively. But there's something within you as well that can do things a little bit differently, even if it's 99% the other person's fault or 100%. Right? There's something you can do to react differently. Do you need to hate them for it? Do you need to be upset about it as long as you are? Could you be forgiving? Could you be loving? Could you listen? So these are the things that can be done differently. That's why, and those things can help to diffuse a conflict. Now, if you have a self-deprecating ego, you'll probably blame it all on yourself. And both are dysfunctional because they're not accurate. And if you blame it all on yourself, you're going to be upset, and then you're going to resent the other person because they're making you feel bad, when it's actually your own ego overabundantly telling you that all these low self-esteem thoughts and blaming stuff on you. But of course it gets transposed onto coming from the other person, but it's your own mind doing it. And so the most shocking thing is that within this whole world and this whole life, we see things and we react to them, but what we're actually seeing is our reactions. Very difficult to actually see a thing for what it is, if it's even possible, because there's always interpretation involved. So the idea is to strip the need to always label, judge, and interpret, and to simply instead perceive. And this is not to say that you lose your mental faculty. As a matter of fact, it works with a sense of sanity now, with a sense of deeper perception, and deeper cognition then comes into play. You can live in a flow state. You can be at peace with things more easily. And you can still know where things are bad and where things are good, and then operate accordingly without the goods and the bads pulling you. You instead choose to go towards the good.